morning, Judy. It's so great to see you today.
Hi, Mary Jean.
Oh, it's wonderful. Thank you so much for doing this interview for Veteran Feminists of America.
My pleasure.
Absolutely.
My pleasure. So happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. So let's just start out with the ordinary stuff. To tell us your name, where you were born, and what year, please.
Judy Goldsmith, and I was born in 1938 in Kossuth, Wisconsin.
Okay. So could you just tell us sort of life before the women's movement? What was your growing up like? What was your ethnic background, if appropriate, or what prepared you for becoming a feminist?
Sure. Life before feminism was pretty grim for women, especially women of my mother's class and background. It was difficult for my mother. She was a working class woman. At one point, she had to go to Kohler, Wisconsin, where my father was working in a factory, because we kids didn't have any money for shoes for the fall, and it was just about time for school to start. So she went, my timid mother, took a bus to Kohler and went to they sent her to the proper department, Human Resources, and the man there said, "Well, I'm very sorry, Mrs. Becker, but I can't give you any money without your husband's permission. Would you like me to take you to where he works?" And she said yes, bravely. And so he took her through the factory to where my father was working, and he said, "George, your wife says she needs money for shoes for the children when school starts. Could I give her a part of your paycheck?" And he said, "My money is my money, and she's not getting a penny of it." And that was it.
Wow. So tell us how many kids there were in the family.
There were 5 children, and we were the 3 oldest at that point, 11, 12, 10, and I was 7 years younger, and my younger sister Carol had just been born. So we were. It was a family very much in need. After my parents were divorced, when my mother found it impossible to continue living with him or being attached to him, especially financially, we moved into a renovated chicken coop that had been owned by one of my wealthier uncles when it was a hunting shed up north for our other uncles to go and hunt deer. And but after a time, one of the uncles said he needed the shed to take to his farm to raise chickens. So that's what he did, and so he raised chickens there for a couple of years, and then he moved it to Sheboygan Falls because we needed a place to live, and
Where did you live while the chickens were being raised?
Well, we were staying with some people who helped us out, who were poor people. They lived underneath on the first floor of a building. We lived on the upper floor, but the building was condemned while we were in it. And they moved out, and we had no place to go. And they said we could come and stay with them until the trailer was moved to part of town where we could settle down. So the trailer was small. The converted chicken coop was hardly comfortable. It was very small. There was a bed, and there was a dresser, and there was a small kitchen table, a wood stove. There was a sink, but there was no running water. So we had to keep a pail underneath it, and we would carry water 2 blocks from the home of a neighbor or of a friend who would let us use their outdoor spigot to bring water. And of course an outdoor toilet. Right. So not fun in the winter.
No.
But it was a situation that even at my young age, and I was 8 at the time, made an impression on me. I've heard people say, I was poor growing up, but I didn't know I was poor. I knew we were poor.
Right.
I could tell. I could see that my young friends lived differently than I did and had things I didn't have. And I didn't necessarily want specific things they had, but I could tell that we were living in a way that was not as good as they were. And I remember thinking at one point this isn't right. People shouldn't have to live like this, because it wasn't a good way to live. It wasn't nice. I would sometimes visit my friends at their homes, and they didn't have outdoor toilets. I mean, this was in town. This wasn't out in the country.
Right.
Although we lived certainly on the edge of town. But that made a powerful impression on me. My mother worked in woolen mills, which was a textile factory, and did not make very much money. She made $40 a week. And I remember one time my older sister, who often cared for us, she was 7 years older than I, was sent to get some groceries, and she lost a $20 bill, and that was tragedy at that time. So it was a difficult life when we were living there. We did eventually move to Two Rivers, to an apartment, an upstairs apartment, in a home that my mother's father owned. My maternal grandparents lived in Two Rivers. The sad thing about that was, and even before in the trailer, was that we lost our brothers. They could not, there wasn't enough room there, obviously, for 5 kids.
Right.
So they had to go and stay with aunts and uncles, and we never did get back together again as a family. So that was difficult. But in Two Rivers, we did much better. We had a bathroom with a tub and running water, and it really felt like a castle. It was wonderful. It was a small upstairs apartment, but it was marvelous. My mom slept on a hide-a-bed in the living room with my older sister, and I slept in a bed with Carol, the baby, who at that point was about 2 years old.
Okay.
So it was, the good thing about that part of our life was that Mom was in control. She made very little, not a whole lot more than she had in the woolen mills, but the money was hers, the money was ours.
Yes.
And she could manage it. And I remember even on occasion being able to go and get a hot fudge sundae at the local drugstore for 25 cents. And that felt like real luxury, so it was wonderful. But I do remember during those years, the intervening years, I remember some remarkable historical events. I remember when we were still in the trailer, I remember in the trailer, I remember Roosevelt dying and my mother crying.
Right.
And when your mother cries, you remember that, so I remembered that. I remembered the end of World War II because that was a very happy time. Everyone went out into the streets, and Mrs. Herber, who owned the drugstore down at the corner, gave all the kids free nickel candy bars. So that was very exciting. But back to Two Rivers, I grew up there, and I loved school. I'd always been rewarded for school because I was a bright kid. One thing made a real point on me, not then but later, realizing that I moved ahead quite quickly, even coming from a background of considerable poverty.
Right.
And in later years, looking at the realities of life for people of color, many of them started in similar backgrounds. I mean, it was pretty poor back then, but I had an advantage. I was white. And so when I got to school in Two Rivers, I just, moved right up the ladder of success because I was immediately recognized as a bright kid. And when you're recognized as a bright kid, teachers respond to that and help you along even more. So I did well in school. But there was no question that there was differential treatment of boys and girls. I didn't think about it a whole lot at the time, but it was clear to me that there was. I just thought, well, that's, the way it is.
The way it is, right.
And that continued in college. I went to college at, first of all, at UWM, Milwaukee, and first of all studied music because I love music very much. But I did really well the first semester, but my grade points were like over 4 semesters, like 3.8, 3.1, 2.8, 2.3. I mean, it was right downhill. And it was in large part because I couldn't deal with the world I was living in, and I couldn't deal with what I was learning. There were horrors in history classes. I was learning about World War II, in the community where I lived in Milwaukee, I was starting to see discrimination. And my very first recollection of seeing black people was at a state fair when a family took me there, a family of one of my friends in school. And I saw two black couples. In those days, which would have been like, I don't know, the early 40s, people dressed up to go to things like the state fair. It seems funny now. But they dressed up, and these two young black couples looked gorgeous. They were beautifully dressed. They were good-looking people, and I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? The first ones I had ever seen outside of geography books. Amazing. So I was very impressed. So it came as a real shock to me and disturbed me greatly to hear about prejudice and about segregation, and it bothered me, as did a number of other things I was learning about. So I experienced something of a crisis at the end of my, beginning of my junior year, and I quit school. Really? Giving up a pretty remarkable scholarship at that time that I'd gotten in Two Rivers from a local manufacturing company that was $1,000 a year, which at that time paid for tuition, room and board, and books with a little spending money left over.
Amazing.
And so I gave that all up and then started to explore the world. I worked, and boy, that was a learning experience.
What kind of work did you do?
Factory work, office work, anything that you could do, because I didn't have any degrees or anything at that time, or any skills, and I had absolutely no sense of self-worth. I never did up to that point. Being female and Midwestern and poor doesn't give you a whole lot, in that period of time. Doesn't give you a lot of self-confidence. So I did those kind of crummy jobs, and partly it was because I would go to the want ads, and the want ads were help wanted male, help wanted female. Right. People today find that funny. When I would teach classes here at UW Fond du Lac, students would laugh when I tell them that. I'd say, "Oh yes, really, that was true." Right. I brought them copies of papers, and it was so it didn't take long to realize that first of all, there were way more jobs on the male side of the classified ads, and they paid way better than the women's side. Right. And the women's side would even often say, attractive woman wanted for a receptionist position. Right. I mean, it was very bad. And I was still, to some extent, I mean, I didn't like it at all, but what was I going to do about it? Right. I was a little nobody from Two Rivers, so it bothered me, but we didn't do anything about it, so I just continued in those lines of work. At about that time, met my soon-to-be husband, Dick Goldsmith, and he had just gotten out of the Army. Having been let go, it was an honorary discharge or a general discharge under honorary circumstances or something like that. Okay. Because he had refused to take part in war exercises. Okay. And so we immediately connected and actually soon started living together, which was pretty remarkable from my perspective, from my background. We did not do that. Right. But that was the way it was, and Dick was very assertive and very smart, very bright, and I adored him. So we lived together, and then we got married. He wasn't working either, and that kind of became a pattern throughout our lives. And so we decided that we would get married, and we did, and stayed living in Milwaukee, but then we decided we both needed to finish college. I had quit, and he had quit when he joined the Army. Okay. So we both went to Stevens Point, which was where he had gone. And at Stevens Point, did I ever blossom as a student? I mean, I had done, okay starting out in Milwaukee, but in Stevens Point, I just exploded. And a lot of it, I realized later, was because I was married now. And I was older. I mean, older students, sometimes called non-traditional, bring a lot of experience that kids right out of high school don't. Right. They have these little spirals in their eyes, and they don't know much of anything. They're sweet, but they don't know much. and you bring that, but I was also married, which meant I no longer had to compete. I had not really been aware of competing before that for available guys, but when you're a heterosexual female, you do, without thinking of that. And of course, marriage, et cetera, et cetera. So, but when I was married and went back to school, that was just not a factor, and I hadn't realized that. And it was pretty remarkable because I just zoomed to the top of the honor roll.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, Dick did not. He didn't like school. He was not. He wasn't good in the classroom. He didn't like taking orders, and so he did not do well. But I continued to do well, and eventually got a fellowship, a scholarship to University of New York at Buffalo, to teach English. To teach freshman English as I started my master's degree. I was focused academically, but there was something else going on in the world at this time. There was Vietnam, and there was civil rights, and all of this was and Dick was also very activist oriented, so he was also, similarly inclined in that direction.
Right.
And we went on some demonstrations. I did what little I could do, but I had a problem now because I was in graduate school, and graduate school in English was about 14th century alliterative poetry and a lot of things that I kept saying, why do I care? And I mean, there are good reasons to care about those things, but at that time, I thought, this is totally irrelevant to my world, and I don't feel like doing it anymore. So Dick did a really good thing. He did help me get me through my master's degree.
Okay.
And so I got that and got my master's degree and started teaching at one of the poverty program schools in Buffalo. In the 60s, there were some nice poverty programs that had been instituted as part of an anti-poverty initiative, and there were some good things happening, and one of them was that program. So this was a program to help students who had gone to the inner city schools in Buffalo but hadn't learned very much.
Okay.
And so I was teaching them English, and my students were mostly from the urban ghetto, most of the black communities, but also from the poorer Polish communities, other communities, and so we had all of these kids with very compromised academic backgrounds, and I taught English. One thing that happened there was I designed a course called the Blitz that taught all of the English basics about grammar, how the language is structured. You really can't learn English if you don't know how the language is put together. And you don't realize that. I mean, I never had to learn it because I grew up speaking standard English.
Right.
Not everybody did.
Right.
So I put together this week-long course, and I asked the school administrators, I said, can I teach this? Can I take the first week of the incoming new students and teach them this? And we worked it out with the other faculty, and they let me do it. And I did that for several semesters, and it was wonderful. And the kids were not kids, some of them were, obviously older people, but they responded so positively, and I loved that. So that was an important part of my life at that point. It was also changing in that the ongoing issues with the war and with civil rights was becoming more and more predominant. You couldn't escape it. It was there. And Dick and I started to work on housing issues in the black community because it was really bad there, and got very involved with the civil rights community. And as that happened, that was the time that Martin Luther King was assassinated, and it shook our world, and we pretty much stopped everything we were doing and started organizing for a demonstration in honor of Dr. King, and that got us involved with a lot of people who were doing a number of things, and there were a couple of women who came to see me at that time who had been involved in the National Organization for Women.
Oh.
And I didn't care for them a lot. I mean, their personalities weren't, I just didn't relate to them.
Okay.
And I had heard of it, but not much.
Right.
And it just didn't really
Appeal.
move me. Yeah,
Okay.
it wasn't right. Besides, I was at the time getting pregnant and having my daughter Rachel, which will take your mind off of a lot of things.
Right.
So I had Rachel, which was a wonderful experience, but also a real learning experience in terms of parenting roles, because I had been a very independent woman, and now I had a child who I adored, but they need care 24 hours a day.
Right.
And I was still working, but this was summer, had time off, and I could not get out. I mean, I couldn't run up to the drugstore to buy a magazine. I couldn't do it because Dick was gone all the time doing I don't remember what. But a man has to do what a man has to do.
Right.
And it was getting really hard for me. I remember one time when Rachel was an early riser, and she was up like 5 o'clock that morning, and I'd gotten up and taken care of her and fed her and did her laundry, and I was exhausted when Dick got home about 9, 10 o'clock, and I said, could you please watch Rachel for an hour because I've got to get some rest. And he said, well, there goes my day.
Oh,
And
imagine that.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Something cracked. And I got to thinking about this a lot more. Well, I'm going to shortcut this because the marriage disintegrated, did not go well after that point. I said at some point, I can't raise Rachel in Buffalo. It was not a good environment. It was a home of a lot of mafia groups,
Really?
and yeah, the whole Niagara Buffalo area was a home for the mafia organizing, and it was dirty and it was corrupt, and I didn't like it. And I said, I want to go home. I want to go to Wisconsin. I want to raise my child in Wisconsin.
Okay.
So we did. We came back to Wisconsin, and we moved to a place just outside of Manitowoc. Manitowoc and Two Rivers being very close together, and my sister's home was just about a mile down the road, so it was a nice arrangement. Something happened during that time. We also had a great big backyard. Rachel could play outside.
Right.
It was wonderful. But my younger sister Carol, and I heard that there was a Now chapter starting in Two Rivers. And we thought that was pretty remarkable, that a Now chapter would start in Two Rivers of all places. Two Rivers, really? not a hotbed of anything.
Right.
So we went more out of curiosity than anything. I told her about my encounter with the women in Buffalo. I said, yeah, I wasn't impressed. But our group got together, our founding group. There were 10 of us. We were astonished that there were 10 women who thought of themselves as maybe feminists. And that night was just some kind of word for this that means wonderful things. That means a real insight, a real understanding of something we'd never understood before. Because you think you're alone. You think you're the only person who's had these problems. Doctors treating you with disrespect and not being able to get decent jobs that you know you could do, and all kinds of things. And we said, oh my God, you too? Really, you too? We all did.
Excellent.
And it was so many women around the country had that experience.
That's right.
In one way or another.
Right.
And so we said, okay, yeah, we will do this, yeah. So we started a chapter, and not having really any idea of what we would do, but we got materials from the national office.
Okay.
And we had a founding meeting, which I could not attend because I couldn't get childcare. So I was home, and they called me from the meeting, and they said, well, we've elected you coordinator. I was like, president, like coordinator. And I said, I can't do that. I've never done anything. What are you kidding? And they said, well, you'll learn. It'll be fine. And I did.
A feminist endorsement. Yes.
Yes. And the first thing we did was we picketed Sears.
Oh, beautiful.
That was our first
Sears
action. We said,
campaign.
this Mary Jean Collins says that this is a very good thing to do. And because Sears had really bad discriminatory, well, you know
Right.
all about that.
Right.
And so we picketed the Sears in Manitowoc. There wasn't one in Two Rivers. And before we did that, we had to go and see the police, and I was elected as president, coordinator of the organization, the chapter, to go and talk to the police. I was a little intimidated about that, but I think they were too. And the officer I talked to said, well, okay, just don't litter and don't obstruct traffic, and then you should be okay. So we said that's good. And we picketed on 8th Street in the main street in Manitowoc, and cars would go by and give us a peace sign and thumbs up, and it was quite wonderful. So we were very positively reinforced with that. So our chapter grew and got more and more involved, and really loved what was happening, what we were learning, we were exploring. Now starting to really look at the issues that had plagued us all of our lives and understanding how that worked and what happened. We did a leadership workshop, getting together and on a Saturday afternoon, and we're learning about leadership because we were very shy about leadership. I remember one of the exercises was stand in a row, and your place in the row should be determined by your position of leadership in the organization, in the chapter. So if you're the most important person, you stand first and second. So we're looking at each other, and the person who's first said, "Whoa, not me, no, not me," and shifts to start. And then the next person is moving down because nobody wants that position because that seems pushy.
Yeah.
And as we know, girls aren't supposed to be pushy. So we went through a lot of that and started to get information about the state organization. And one of our members, whose name was Leslie, we said, you should go to a state meeting because I can't get childcare.
Right.
And find out what this state organization is all about and what should we know about it. So she went to that meeting. And she came back, and our chapter met, and she said, well, it was a really good meeting, but they're planning the state conference, and at that time there's only one officer, the state coordinator.
Right.
And she said they couldn't find anybody to run for state coordinator, and I told them you'd be good. I said I would kill her, but it turned out that
you would be good.
I did in fact do that, and I went to the state conference. The first state conference I'd ever been to, Wisconsin being the first state organization that was formed in now.
That's right.
Not surprising, with Catherine Conroy and Kate Clarenbach, yeah. So I started going to the meetings and loved the women. They were so wonderful. And I went to my first state conference, and it was terrifying. It was, I have to tell you one quick little story about we hadn't had a lot of contact with the Milwaukee chapter, but we'd heard that there were lesbians in the Milwaukee chapter, and we thought, well, that's good, but we don't know anything about that. But so we were the first night of the conference. These women walked in, and they were clearly from Milwaukee, and maybe a little bit scary.
Yeah.
And Leslie and I went to our room because I'd gotten several boxes of stuff I had to go through from the previous coordinator. And after about a half an hour, there was a phone call, and it was one of the Milwaukee women who wanted to meet me.
I see.
And I said, okay. They said, meet us at the pool table. And I said, okay. And I said, Leslie, if I'm not back in an hour, come and get me. And I went down to the pool table and met the Milwaukee women, and oh my God, did we have fun. We had such fun. I'd never shot pool.
Okay.
They told me I was wonderful. They lied. They totally lied. And we ended up literally almost under the pool table singing feminist songs. And Leslie came down and found me singing songs and drinking beer with the women from Milwaukee, having just a wonderful time. Well, I got to know them all Oh, and many of them became some of my dearest friends in the organization. Sue Lukey,
Right.
who had chaired the National Bylaws Committee when we changed the bylaws. Other women who were just wonderful. And the state conference was scary, but also really interesting. Met some wonderful women and went to had some great programs. And then at the end of it, I had to sit down and go over all of the finances and be sure that everything was reconciled with the money that had come in for the conference and everything. And then went home in a snowstorm driving and it was all like a nightmare at that point.
Right.
But little by little, I grew into this position that they said I would grow into, and it was the state organization was excellent, was a terrific one, and I'll shortcut that a little bit too because there was a lot to it, but it followed pretty true to form with probably most organizations. We grew and we attracted new members, and we did some things that raised our visibility in the community and also got more active at the state level. So I was now a state coordinator and traveled around the state some, which was a new experience for me too. I really barely learned to drive, but I was all over the state and it was exciting. And meeting the most wonderful people. Everywhere I went, the women in now were wonderful. I was so impressed with them. They're like a special kind of person, very positive, very warm, very loving, and so it was a terrific experience. And then then there was a regional conference coming up, and before that, I was going to quit the presidency after the end of my first year, the coordinatorship. I was going to quit because it was too much. I had Rachel, I was teaching at UW Manitowoc, teaching English there. I forgot to mention that. And it was all too much. So there was a regional conference just before our conference at which I was going to quit. And Catherine Conroy was there, and many of the other founding women, Kay Clarenbach was there. And at the end of the conference, which was wonderful, we were sitting around the bar and having fun, just talking. And at one point, Catherine Conroy, the great Catherine Conroy, who was tough as nails and sweet as could be, on the other side of the bar, yelled across the bar and said, "Goldsmith!" And I said, "Oh, yes, Catherine, yes." She said, "I hear you're quitting." And I said, yeah, I am. She said, "Why are you quitting?" And I said, "Because I'm tired." She said, "What?" I said, so she got me. I mean, she just totally humiliated me into saying, so by the time I left there, I was committed to
running again,
which I did.
That's fun.
And at the end of that, there was a regional conference, and at that point, I actually ran for the first position I ever ran for. I ran for the National Board of Directors, and won that. I was still active in the chapter, but as you know, then the way your life changes is you go to national board meetings, and they were at that point still pretty much around the country.
Right.
So that was interesting.
Yes.
I'd never hardly been out of Wisconsin.
Right.
And meeting people at the national level, and I liked them. There were some wonderful people. There were some people I didn't care for as much, who seemed to have a different perspective on not so much feminism, but on how you approach it. That seemed more hard-edged, and I mean, I was learning, so I wasn't thinking too much about it.
Right.
I had at our state conference, the first state conference, met Marianne Sade, who was our regional director at that time when I was first becoming coordinator. And I met Marianne because I said, "Marianne, I need you to teach me about what's happening at National," because we knew there were tensions at National. This was after the New Orleans board meeting. And she did something that impressed me so much. It was definitely one of the reasons I decided to stay in the organization. She said, "Okay, I will tell you about this. There are basically two sides." But she said, "I have to tell you in fairness that I am allied with one side. So I may not be entirely objective in what I tell you, but I will do my very best to tell you as objectively as I can what I believe is going on. And I thought, wow, what a great thing. What a wonderful way to approach this. She's not going to say, okay, well, those people, you can't believe what they, nothing like that.
Right. Okay.
She was, I don't know if she was an attorney at that
Yeah,
time, but boy,
in the process,
she was
right,
good.
yeah.
She was good. So that was an attitude that really drew me in. So anyway, I did get on the board, and it was still very unpleasant. There were still tensions, and we had a national conference coming up. So we said, yes, we should go to the conference. We should be represented. Nobody from, well, individuals had probably gone, but there had been no state delegation ever went to the state national conference. So we went, and we'd heard there was difficulty. We'd heard there was this tension on the board between a group called the Majority Caucus and the other people who weren't specifically identified. And it reflected that attitude I had seen in some people on the board that troubled me, kind of. Sort of a different philosophy, a different way of relating to each other. Because I had grown up in Wisconsin now with a sense of sisterhood. That was sweet and supportive, and I mean, really a very positive thing. And I didn't see that in those people. But we went to Philadelphia. Our group, our contingent of, I don't remember, but we had a good number of people who went. And we went with love in our hearts and looking for sisterhood. There was a song. Philadelphia, here we are, following our woman's star. I don't remember the rest of it, but it was so sweet.
It was always a song where Judy Goldsmith was.
Yeah,
I know that.
yeah, that's
right.
That's right. So it was fun, and we went there and we said, well, we can make this work, and we got to Philadelphia and we ran into a buzzsaw. It was shocking because it's like going from tepid water into ice water. It was not pleasant at all because they treated us like enemies. People we never met gave us dirty looks, and we could not understand where that was coming from. And there was all of this tension as the conference started on the floor, all of this tension, and it was a huge, huge crowd of people because we were not delegated at that time. And so the conference was packed by people from the East Coast, Majority Caucus people, and we were, I mean, as naive as we were, we could start to see what was happening. We had some candidates we wanted to support, including a Mary Jean Collins Robeson at that point, running for president, and it was just difficult. We were pretty new to parliamentary procedure. We studied it and stuff, and we used it in our meetings and at the state level, of course. But there were things going on that just seemed to be really almost hateful. I hate to use the word, but almost hateful, and not being able to understand it. I mean, we kept trying to make contact, and we're not getting anywhere. There seemed to be goings on procedurally with the conference that seemed inappropriate, that were problems with credentialing and all kinds of things that just seemed wrong. At one point, we held a caucus. People called it non-majority caucus, and I said, we can't call it non-majority caucus because we're not non-anything.
Right.
But it was Midwestern primarily, and we held a caucus, and there were a couple Majority Caucus people who came, who were invited. I think Ellie may have been there.
Okay.
But it was clear that we were up against something that was not good, that we didn't want to support, that did not align with our sense of feminist relationships, feminist identity, or feminist agenda. And we were very upset about that. But the Majority Caucus was not giving an inch in any way. So there was a whole lot of frustration, and there was the election. The election was so mangled, so bizarre. It went on endlessly. There were things that went wrong. There were things that nobody could explain. And we started to get suspicious, of course, in that atmosphere of somebody fiddling with what was going on with the elections. But we were all determined we were going to vote. We didn't give a damn how long this was going to take, and it took well into the wee hours of the morning, early morning hours, and towards the end, we had to go up flights of stairs. People were literally crawling up the stairs and then crawling across the floor to get to the voting booth so we could vote. It was unbelievable. When I came home, I wrote a report to Wisconsin Now about what it was like, and I described that.
Okay.
It was unbelievable. And we did get to bed, finally. We did, and we got to the plenary session the next morning and got the announcement of the winners, and it was not the people we had supported. And so I don't remember exactly how it all ended, but we left, and the plane stopped in Cleveland, and we held a Cleveland caucus. We got off the plane. Oh, I guess we changed planes there. And we held a caucus and decided that we were who we were. We weren't going to be a non-anything. We were now. And we were going to move forward with our Wisconsin program, which was a good program. And we got on the plane and we went back to Milwaukee, and we were coming off the plane. And we sang another song. I'm trying to think what it was. Hey, Wisconsin, here we are. It's following our woman's star. We went there, we did it, fought for our cause. We're sisters, still sisters, and in spite of all the flaws there, hey, Wisconsin, we're okay. And we want to proudly say, we will do it in our way. Hey, Wisconsin, we're okay.
Wonderful.
And they were standing there with roses for each of us, holding up, you give us bread, we bring you roses.
Oh, beautiful.
And it was amazing. So in Wisconsin, we were good. We were really good, yeah. So then, from there on, we went from that to the Constitutional Convention, the CONCON, to change our bylaws in Kansas City.
Right.
And Wisconsin played a pretty strong role there, a leadership role in determining how things went. And there, because that conference also was not delegated, it was our territory. We clearly outnumbered the other side.
Okay.
And so we got what we wanted, but I felt really strongly about not gloating. So if we won something and our people would start to cheer, I would say, no. They lost. Have respect for that. We got what we wanted. That's the important thing. But, don't go hurting them, because we need to work with them. So don't do that.
Good.
And it was, we came out of that okay. That was followed by the Detroit conference. I was still on the board. And the Detroit conference was better because it was delegated. It was also in, quote, our territory.
Right.
And it was a good deal more civil and positive, and we moved forward from there. I can't quite remember. It was not long after that Martha Buck, who had been executive vice president, resigned.
She did, yes.
And needed to be replaced.
Right.
And I got a considerable amount of lobbying from people around the country, from Wisconsin certainly, and from people around the country who urged me to run. And this was going to be a selection by the national board, not a regular election, because it was in between, it was interim. And the other person running was Alice Chapman, who I loved dearly. She was from Connecticut. She was a wonderful woman. She was a finance person and one of the dearest people in the world. raised how many kids? I don't remember.
I don't remember.
8 kids, but yeah, she was terrific. And so we ran, and we both ran for that position, and everyone agreed it was absolutely the most civilized election that had ever been
I
held.
can appreciate that.
And now, and I won, and Alice and I worked together very closely because she became the national treasurer at the next election, and so we worked together. I was vice president, and working with Ellie and working with the other majority caucus people in the office, although no, they weren't identifying themselves as that anymore.
So explain, did it involve moving?
It involved moving physically. I had to move to DC, and that was really hard because I loved Wisconsin. It was home to me, and I didn't want to go to DC. So before I made that decision to take the vice presidency, I had to figure out whether I could manage that, because it meant taking Rachel with me, and I knew nothing about what kind of childcare might be available. It turned out there was nothing, and it was really hard. I didn't want to leave here, and I didn't want to go to a strange big city. I knew big cities, but it wasn't the city I was worried about so much. It was the environment I was moving into, because the people who were leadership at that time had all been majority caucus.
Correct, yeah.
And so I was going into a strange environment. They were decent to me when I got there, but I was given all of the what we called scut work, cleaning out the files and the mailing process and all of that. I did have to raise money for a big fundraiser that we had for a march that we were having at that time in Washington, D.C., and I had to raise money for it. And in D.C., in Washington, D.C., where I'd never been before.
Right.
And knowing nobody. And so I held what came to be known as the Great Fund Losing Program that just did not really work very well at all. But and I had some suspicion at the time that might have been maybe managed, give the kid fundraising.
Right.
But that didn't matter, because I was very committed, because we were working on the Equal Rights Amendment. And that was huge, and I hadn't ever felt that way about anything in my life as strongly as I felt about that. So it didn't matter to me really how I was being treated by people in the office.
Right.
And some of them were decent, and it's okay. The biggest problem for me personally was there was no help. I'd had some help promised from some people in the office that when I got there, there'd be childcare help for me. There was absolutely none.
Nothing.
So there I was with a job that was at that time pretty much 12 hours a day.
Do you remember exactly or sort of how old Rachel was at that point?
She was 7.
7. She was a little girl.
Yeah. And so she was in school, and although at first when we got there, because it was summer, the first summer she stayed with Dick in Buffalo, because I couldn't, just setting up, my house and everything. But then when she got there, when she came, she started school, and so she was in school during that time, but after that I had to go and take care of her. So I was adjusting to the office as well I could, and trying to learn my role, which wasn't very well defined, but and not getting a whole lot of support for that. But the thing was, it was the Equal Rights Amendment, and that was key. And so a lot of us, regardless of what positions we held, were out organizing.
Right.
And that was great. And I went to North Dakota. Pure, North Dakota?
Pure North Dakota.
Yeah. Went
Pure
to
South Dakota.
Yeah.
Right.
And it was great. I loved that. I loved being out and organizing. So we did a lot of that. We did marches, we did demonstrations, and I was involved in all of that. One of the things I did was I coordinated national conferences.
Okay.
And one was in San Antonio.
Okay.
And that was nice. I loved San Antonio.
Right.
So that was lovely. But so I organized conferences, and I did that sort of thing, and I organized some events.
So would you just say who the officers are at this point that you joined
At this point, it is Ellie Smeal and Arlie Scott
Okay.
and Eve Norman,
Right.
Sandy Roth,
Sandy Roth. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
and me. So we're working on the Equal Rights Amendment, and the Equal Rights Amendment goes down, which is a real stunning blow to the organization. I was very angry because the press kept interpreting it as now losing, that the women who were fighting this battle had lost. And I said, no, we didn't lose. Women of the country lost, and the system of justice failed because it wasn't given an opportunity to succeed.
Right.
And no, it wasn't. We didn't lose, but that doesn't matter. That's the way the political system sees things. So.
Right.
We turned to some other issues. We turned to insurance discrimination, and I can't remember much of the general agenda at that point, but there was an election coming up. Okay, I remember. There was a meeting, a national board meeting, not in Washington, somewhere else, and I remember being at that point really disgusted with the way I was being treated by the other officers in the organization, and had it up to here, and I was really ready to let it all go. And at this meeting that we had, the other officers started being really, really nice to me. Sandy Roth came over and kind of rubbed my shoulder and said, "How are you doing?" What the hell is this? What's going on? And some of the others were being very unusually, uncharacteristically nice to me. And then they started getting really nice to me. And then it was clear that they wanted me to run again for vice president for the actual position, so that I was then a part of their team. And it got a lot better. My focus after that in the office was on direct mail, and I did a lot of that. I was good at writing, and I did some writing with our direct mail people. One of our major fundraisers was the National Walkathons that happened with our chapters all across the country, and that had really become our major #1 fundraiser beyond the direct mail.
For the ERA campaign.
For the ERA campaign.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So that was going very well.
June, I think, of 1982.
Yeah.
Ellie's term, there was term limits in the
There were term
bylaws,
limits, so
correct?
she couldn't run again.
She couldn't run again,
And I
right.
had decided I was going to go home.
Right, exactly. Okay.
Yeah,
Talk
I
about
said,
that a little
okay,
bit. What changed your mind?
this has all been fun. Thank you all very much, but
Right.
I miss Wisconsin. I'm going to go. I'm going to take
Right.
my daughter, and go
Right.
home.
Right.
And I started getting some pressure to stay, and including from Ellie, to run for the presidency.
Right.
And I said, I don't want to. It
Right.
surprised her, but I didn't want to. But I kept getting pressure, including actually my sister. I'd asked my sister Carol to come to DC to get my car and drive it home, because I was all set to go.
Right.
And so she came, we had dinner that first night, and she said to me, "Are you really content to leave the organization in the hands of people who are running for president?" And that was a hard question, because I didn't think I was. And she said, "Well, then I think you have to think about that really seriously."
Okay.
So I did, and I decided that I would stay and I would run. So I ran for the presidency with Ellie's support and with a team of people that included that included Mary Jean Collins.
Right. Do you want to talk about how the presidency ended?
Oh, the presidency ended in a particularly unpleasant way. Ellie Smeal, who had strongly urged me to run for re-election, or for election to the presidency because she'd not been able to, and who strongly supported my running that first time, decided that she would run against me, because I did, of course, decide to run again, especially after our great victory in San Francisco. she decided that she would run against me. She would run also for the presidency of Now, which shocked me. I'm not sure it should have, but it did, and it became quite unpleasant at that time because it injected an element of division that we had not had for a while. I mean, things came together so strongly around Jerry Ferraro's candidacy and the march, the March on Washington. Things had come together so strongly for that it was starting to feel like a healing time.
Right.
And this really set us back on our heels again. And it was, so the organization was now divided. An organization that had been coming together was divided. And it was, people were taking sides. Because there's a lot that went on during those brief years, I wanted to kind of pick and choose what I'm going to talk about, and there are two major things I'd like to go over because I think they were particularly impactful and important. And the first one was the 1983 March on Washington. This was the 20th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington, which was the great I Have a Dream speech march with Dr. Martin Luther King. And we felt as an organization, because there had been difficulty, while we were very strongly committed to rights for all women, and certainly women of color, because they suffered a double discrimination. That was not necessarily perceived by black women. They didn't necessarily feel included. And so we said we need to do something major and devote some resources to it. And so we decided to become co-sponsors with Coretta Scott King and the other march co-sponsors for the 1983 March. And the board determined that we would do that. We made something of a major sacrifice to do that because it was on the same date as what would have been our nationwide walkathons, ERA walkathons. And so we gave up the walkathons and we invested some money in this march because we felt it was really critical, really important, and we needed to be upfront on our commitment to women of color and to people of color. And so I talked with Coretta Scott King, and which was a wonderful, wonderful experience, and said we would like to co-sponsor and would like to be involved. And she said, well, I would like to have you as a co-chair of the march, and for which I was immensely grateful because we had a lot of planning meetings. Most of them were in Atlanta at the King Center, and it was difficult to describe what it meant to me personally to work with Coretta Scott King because she was like, she was a heroine. She and her husband were almost mythological characters to us. And as I said, we had my ex-husband and I, my then husband and I had mounted a big demonstration after Dr. King was assassinated. So this was really something to be involved in. And we did work together. We traveled together on buses a few times up and down the East Coast in order to promote the march. And so I got to know her very well and know that she was more deeply committed and active than I think most people knew. I think it was because she was maybe regarded by some of the men in the civil rights community as being, the good wife in the background. Mm-hmm. And she was an activist, and it was really great that she had this opportunity to lead this very important event. So we had meetings. We met in Atlanta. I remember that among the people we met with were Andrew Young, who was, I don't think he was at that time, but he had been mayor of New Orleans. He had also been UN.
Atlanta, wasn't he?
Pardon?
Wasn't he mayor of Atlanta?
Mayor of Atlanta, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Mayor of Atlanta, who was mayor of Atlanta. And he had also been UN ambassador for this country, and it was a very, very impressive man. He came to some meetings, and Walter Fauntleroy, who was the D.C. representative at that time for the District of Columbia. Jesse Jackson, of course, was also a co-sponsor. there were many outstanding leaders who were part of that. One of them I remember was a man, of course, whose name is going to escape my mind right at the moment, but it will come back to me. A black man who had started voting when the Voting Rights Act passed, and so he had a right, and he lived in the South, and he went to vote in his community, and there was a group of white men standing in the doorway, and they said, "Where are you going, boy?" And he said, I'm going to vote, sir." And he went in, he walked past them, and they came after him and said, "Where do you think you're doing?" He said, "I'm going to vote." And they knocked him down to the ground. And he got up, and they knocked him down again. And they knocked him unconscious and carried him out. He was a reverend, and his name will come back to me. I know he was a wonderful man, worked with him closely, an extremely eloquent speaker. So these were people who worked together, pulled together all major national organizations. These were not just typically characteristic civil rights organizations, but women's organizations, environmental groups, peace groups. There were a large number of groups participating, including, for the first time, gay rights groups, which was something that we had worked out on a late night telephone conversation. It was one of those things you can't describe. First of all, working with Coretta, knowing her, we would call each other up and discuss these things, and it was to know her personally was so powerful. First to know her as a legendary figure, and then as a human being, and so very gracious and warm. I recall vividly one time we were in a black church in Connecticut, and after the speeches finished, we went down in the basement, and there were tables set up, and Coretta and I sat next to each other, and there were march posters promoting the march, that people could come along with their posters and have everybody sign the poster. And they would come to Mrs. King, and the look on I sat next to her, the look on their faces as they looked at her, it was just what brought tears to my eyes. It was wonderful. And she would sign their march poster, and then they'd start to walk away, and she'd say, "Oh, no, you must have Mrs. Goldsmith sign your poster too." Funny. And they didn't care. They didn't know me from Adam.
Right.
But she was lovely. And that march was huge, and it was remarkable for the commitment that was made by I think for the first time in many ways, inter-organizational, inter-issue involvement and understanding that if we were not together, if we were separate and individual, we were vulnerable. But as long as we could stick together, we were a power. And that day, I think, certainly proved it. There were positive effects that came after that still in some ways remain with us, but there's always backsliding also. But that was a real landmark moment, I think. And Now's role was significant, and I felt really good about our taking that action and making clear this is where Now is. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, which also had major and long-lasting effect, was the presidential election of 1984, which was the election in which Walter Mondale ran for the presidency. And we decided that it was important for the organization this time to endorse a presidential candidate. We didn't previously, because that would involve picking, of course, one person who was a member of a party, and we saw ourselves very legitimately as nonpartisan. But we also felt that if we didn't support a candidate, we would be forever on the sidelines, and we needed to be in the middle of this. So we did. We had a very extensive process that involved meeting with all of the staff of all major Democratic candidates. We didn't do the Republican candidate because that was Ronald Reagan.
Right.
And we clearly did not want him. So We worked really well and really extensively with a lot of wonderful staff people. I remember in particular Nikki Heideprim from the Mondale campaign. We worked with Ann Lewis. We worked with people whose names I can't now remember.
Wendy.
Pardon?
Wendy?
Wendy Sherman. Wendy Sherman from Barbara Mikulski's office. And Barbara Mikulski was a co-chair of the campaign. And Wendy was wonderful. She is now, of course, a highly regarded ambassador, Ambassador Wendy Sherman. It was a time when we met and got involved with the leadership of the organizations in a way I think that we really had never done previously. All of us. It was, I do remember the one recurring phrase when we would have problems, between organizations and our tensions or whatever, that someone would say that we were acting like a firing squad in a circle. Right. And that was too often the case. Right. But this really focused our energies, and we came together, and because we knew how much was at stake for this election. We worked around the country. As president, I did trips all around the country, supported by our PAC. I went to Alaska. Right. Had a wonderful time in Alaska working with people up there, traveling around the country, and with our members and organizations all around the country. It was the thing was that Mondale had in fact chosen a woman vice presidential candidate.
You want to talk about Now's role in that?
Now's role in selecting the vice presidential candidate was major. It was significant. We had done a lot of research that indicated that a woman on the Democratic ticket would make a real difference, that it would be something new under the sun, not just two white men together again, that it would bring a fresh perspective to the campaign. Mm-hmm. And that in fact, there was a gender gap in the 1980 election that indicated that women represented a real electoral power potentially, right. And that putting a woman on the ticket would activate that. Right. And so we worked with all of the campaigns, and after extensive discussion and studying, decided that the person we wanted to support was Geraldine Ferraro. That she was strong. She was, of course, excellent on our issues. She was enthusiastic and in a young leadership, but leadership still in the Democratic Party. And we recommended that to Vice President still then Mondale. There was a meeting in. Actually, I was speaking to a group to a Latino group in Texas, and I had gotten a phone call when I got to the airport. I got a phone call that said from my office that said, "Don't come back to Washington. Go to Minnesota." I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because you're meeting with Vice President Mondale." And I said, "All right." So I got on a different plane and flew to Minneapolis, and spent the first of the night there with because I was meeting with Mr. Mondale in the morning. Had dinner. I was invited to go to dinner with some of the national press, members of the national press, who really had a wonderful time. They promised that this would be off the record and I could talk freely. I didn't like to talk off the record because that was always risky. But we had a wonderful discussion. There was actually a cartoon that appeared in the Los Angeles Times that was a cartoon of me with like spirals in my eyes. And the question was, what if Reagan picks a woman vice president? What will now do then?
Oh.
And that was a question they had asked me that night. So so they didn't exactly stay true to their, that this would be off the record. But the next day I met with Vice President Mondale, who was wonderful, thoughtful, very clearly considering carefully what I was talking about and what our research had indicated. There were other people and other groups as well that had been giving him input, but this was, I think that what we had found and our work on those issues had indicated was something that meant quite a bit to him.
Good.
So that was a great discussion, and I flew back home, and it was this was pretty close to the 4th of July. And I remember going home. I don't remember what night it was, but I went home, went to the office, went home late from the office, and flicked on the TV as I always did. And news reporter was saying, breaking news, we have just received word that Vice President Mondale will select Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate. And I'm quite sure I shrieked. I don't remember, but the phone rang almost immediately, and I thought it was one of our people from the office, and it was a voice saying, "Hello, this is CBS News, CBS Television," and I said, "Excuse me," and I hung up. They said, "Is this Judy Goldsmith?" I said, "Excuse me," and I hung up the phone. I couldn't talk to them. I never talked to press without having our press secretary present, because it just was not wise to do that. So I didn't talk to anyone that night, but the next day our office was just crowded with press, and everyone was so excited. And we did a press conference and indicated how happy we were about the decision that we had made and the selection that Vice President Mondale had made. He then stood in the well of the Minnesota State Capitol, the legislature, and did his speech. He said, I looked for the best candidate for vice president, and I found her in Geraldine Ferraro. And I thought that the word "her" hung in the air like a word that had never existed before. It was wonderful. He said it was a very exciting choice, and the crowd roared and erupted. And he looked at the crowd and he said, "Let me say that again. This was a very exciting choice," and they went wild again. So yes, it was. And it was an amazing moment. And the Democratic Convention was held in San Francisco, and it was...
and I believe there's a picture in Newsweek of you and I watching television in the office
Yes.
while the announcement was made.
Yes, there is, absolutely, in Newsweek. Mary Jean Collins and Judy Goldsmith watching the television with very big smiles on our faces. It was wonderful. There was also a period I was surprised to see after that in the international edition of newspapers, a picture of me full front face with my mouth so wide open you could have gotten football into it, and the headline was "A wow from now." That was the reaction. Well, we were of course very excited, and we worked hard all around the country, but almost immediately I have to back up a second, because after we went to there was the convention. I forgot that, the Democratic Convention, and it was a remarkable place to be. The night that she was selected formally at the convention was the Democratic Convention the delegates had to be 50-50 male-female. And that night, because of the importance of that event, the historic nature of the event, most of the male delegates gave up their credentials to a female alternate. So the floor was almost entirely female. And Jerry got on stage, and of course the crowd erupted. And what will always stay in my mind is images from the television coverage of upturned women's faces with tears running down their cheeks, shouting, "Jerry, Jerry," and just watching her and just enchanted and so thrilled and excited that this moment could actually happen. And it was a real turning point. It was women in power in a way that we had never seen in this country before. and something that we very much needed. I often talk, when I was talking to groups of people about the importance of women role models, saying this is important not just for little girls to have models for what they can grow up to be, but it's important for little boys to understand that these are women in leadership and women can be leaders. And also for some big boys to see that women can be leaders, because that had not registered in the national consciousness at that point. So that was a remarkable and truly historic moment. It was a really exciting couple days. My mother was excited because she saw me on television all the time. And I remember there was a newspaper, I think it was the San Francisco Bee, then San Francisco, that did a front page layout that had important Democratic influences on the election. And my picture was first.
Oh, good.
Lane Kirkland from
AFL-CIO.
AFL-CIO was next, and then some Democratic, leadership. I say, excuse me, I was first. That was pretty funny.
Yeah, that's fun.
But it did indicate that now had a role, that we had a major role, and that we were key members of clearly the women's organizations community, as well as other like-minded people, civil rights groups and peace groups and environmental groups, all of us together. And it was a very gay rights. It was a very important moment for that as well. I spoke to some gay rights organizations in San Francisco, and they were very excited about this development as well, because it really meant that there would be a difference. And we said, what this means is that a woman, that there will be someone in the White House, a step away from the presidency, who knows what a woman's experience is, who knows what it is to fight for a job, who knows what it is to be disrespected, who knows what it is to be pregnant, who understands those realities and to fight the discrimination. So this will be very important. And it was important, but the opposition started almost immediately. And people were digging, they were going back 2 generations to find dirt on Jerry or on her husband, who was a real estate agent. They finally found something obscure that he had done that was not a terrible thing, but it didn't look good, and played on that and made the most of that in a very bad way. But they did one thing that I thought was really the most devastating in terms of shaking up women about this and making them rethink their support for Jerry. And it was that the message they started to send, and I heard every time I turned on the news and heard opposition people talking, was they would say, "Are you supporting Geraldine Ferraro just because she's a woman?" And a lot of women would say, "Well, no, of course not." So it started to doubt themselves, because women have always been taught that we need to put ourselves last. Are you actually going to do something that would be good for women? Are you actually going to do something that would be good for yourself? Yes, that would have been good for us, would have been good for all of the women who thought about that. But there was a real guilt that was triggered there, and I've always thought that was a major aspect of the, not so, well, the opposition certainly, but also the loss of enthusiasm from women for her candidacy. And of course we did lose, which was a moment that was hard to describe in some ways, on some levels, almost worse than the loss of the ERA, but very similar. But it did still make an impact. It left a mark, and it was something that I think now can feel very proud about in the work that we did, in the leadership that we took, and the strong positions that we took. One last thing I remember, we had a dear friend in the movement who was a singer-songwriter, Kristen Lems from Illinois, and she had written a song that we quoted a lot in the next couple days, which was, "Women walk more determined than they ever have. Women walk with a stronger stride than they ever have before. Look around, sisters and brothers, because you're going to find you've got another kind of woman who'll give a lot and live a lot, and who'll ask a lot and give a lot and live a whole lot more. And I love that.
Yes.
And I think that was a perfect conclusion to a moment that was the part of my presidency I will never forget.
You know, women walk more determined than they ever have. Women walk with a stronger stride than they ever did before. Take a look, sisters and brothers, 'cause you're gonna find you got another kind of woman who will ask a lot and give a lot and live a whole lot more. My friend, you and I have come a long way, and we're gonna go farther still. For the more I learn about myself and my world, you know, the more both of us will. All the ancient fears are coming out now, and I'm getting them under control. For I realize until I love myself, nothing else is gonna make me whole. You know, women walk more determined than they ever have. Women walk with a stronger stride than they ever did before. Take a look, sisters and brothers, 'cause you're gonna find you got another kind of woman who will ask a lot and give a lot and live a whole lot more. You know, it's hard to break all the traditions, and sometimes we wanna give up, but we gotta keep going, gotta keep on growing, 'cause love ain't gonna let us stop. You know, we owe it to each other to grow as wise as we can get, and we'll get to the end, my sister and friend. We haven't seen the best of it yet. Do you remember how it used to be now? All the games we used to play, never bringing it out, full of defenses and doubt. Now everything that we believe we can say.